Welcome to another Conduct Detrimental. I am Dan Lust. Dan Wallach and I convened for a Twitter Spaces earlier today. We were on for about an hour and 15 minutes, so we're going to reproduce the audio here. We're not going to reinvent the wheel. I'm joined now by Mike Lawson, our producer extraordinaire. We're going to try to tie up some loose ends that have come out since Dan and I recorded our Spaces. Mike, kind of a big day for the Deshaun Watson saga. It is certainly not the end, as we addressed in our Twitter Spaces, but we are certainly closing one chapter. What are your overall thoughts?
So Peter Harvey made his ruling, and the suspension was increased from 6 games to 11 games, as well as a fine of $5 million for Deshaun Watson. That, coupled with the NFL and the Browns putting in $1 million for a total of $7 million to create a fund that will support nonprofit organizations to educate healthy relationships, sexual misconduct, sexual assault, and survivors and whatnot. But we've covered this so many times, from the start of all of these allegations through the increase of the number of plaintiffs in the civil action, the Busbyisms, everything, you name it. And then we got to a situation where it was the first time the NFL has done a third party, a neutral arbitrator to arbitrate this issue of punishment. Judge Robinson rules 6 games, and then the NFL appeals, and Peter Harvey, who's actually on the NFL's board, so it's not necessarily a neutral or a third party, but it's better, I guess, than Roger Goodell. He makes this ruling here. So I think ultimately you talk about the commonality of settlement, right? And you think that no party is necessarily happy with what the result was, because Watson's camp wanted 6 to 8 games. The NFL wanted at least a season to an indefinite suspension. 11 games kind of sits right in the middle there. That's kind of how it works when you go to arbitration, mediation, settlement. So that's kind of where we've ended up here.
We're going to break it down. Dan and I, again, had our fun Twitter Spaces. Dan and I are 0 for 2 in not having technology issues overcome our Twitter Spaces recently. But, I think we got a lot out. So the only thing that I want to add, you're going to hear us, we're literally breaking this down in real time. We didn't know everything. The only thing, to Mike's point, we did not know at that time about this third-party behavioral expert that had to weigh in. According to Adam Schefter, Deshaun Watson's reinstatement is contingent upon his compliance with the treatment plan. Quote, if he does not comply, his reinstatement could be delayed, plus further discipline. So the third-party behavioral expert, we spent a lot of time on the podcast talking about how Judge Robinson issued this edict that he was not allowed to see masseuses that were not club employed therapists. So it still kind of remains to be seen whether that is still in effect, if Judge Robinson's whole decision was vacated, or if that part was kept, or if this third-party behavioral expert's going to make that kind of recommendation. But I think we can jump right, Mike, to the Spaces. And on the back end, we'll talk about the press conference that was going on while the Spaces was going on, and some of the comments and the official statements that were made by Tony Busby, the attorney, Watson, the Browns. A little bit of a messy situation. But I think before we go to our audio podcast, sponsored by Themis Bar Review, like, we have experienced lawyers on this podcast. We have young lawyers that listen to the podcast. We have just some random sports fans, but this read is specifically for our legal community. For those law students looking to find the top bar prep company in the galaxy, look no further than Themis Bar Review. Head to themisbar.com/condetrimental. We do get a fancy schmancy discount, but we can't tell you what it is. You have to head to the site, and it's a nice discount. Okay, with that said, let us kick it to our Twitter Spaces, a long Twitter Spaces. We emptied the tank. Honestly, Mike, I'm going to say, I'm not really like a bragging person, but I think we've forgotten more Deshaun Watson things than any other podcast has covered. I had totally forgot Busbyisms, and I had so much fun with that. That was like a year and a half ago. I forgot that we used to say that. Listen, we really emptied the tank. We had Dan's audio crapped out after like 15 minutes, so I had to carry the torch for an hour. But there was a lot of Busby things, and I'm literally teaching a class on it, so I was pretty current on all the old stuff. Mike, anything to add before we move over to the Spaces?
No, I don't think we need to bury the lead. We jump right into it.
Okay, let's do it. Let's head over to our Twitter Spaces. Let's hit it.
Let's get started. First of all, Dan, I'll give you your first take on this, because I saw about 20 minutes before the news came out, you put your flag down and you said your prediction Shocker, was 11 games. So, Dan, we are live. I will let you take the first victory lap here.
Well, it's not because my favorite player is Marc Messier. I gave it some, long thought. Basically, it came down to what I felt was what could be a PR victory for the league. And in reading Judge Robinson's opinion, one, I guess, statistic stood out in that as she was analyzing all the prior arbitrations and suspensions under the personal conduct policy, the longest one for sexual misconduct was 10 games. So I thought, well, if it's tied for 10 games, well, maybe this one is worse than the other 10-game one. Well, if you land at 11 games, the league can say that this is the most severe suspension for either violent or nonviolent conduct in the history of the personal conduct policy. It comes a little bit closer to splitting the true difference between Sue Robinson's 6-game suspension and the full year sought by the NFL and then postseason games. So maybe it was a little bit closer to where where Watson wanted it to be than it was where the league wanted it to be. But the 11 games being the longest in the history of the personal conduct policy, I thought was something that the league could hold out there as, in the face of any criticism over the severity of the suspension. I mean, it's as far as they've ever gone to suspend any player, and there have clearly been cases that have been as bad, if not worse than this.
So a couple things, and I've just retweeted both of them. People need to look at this. So the Browns have issued a statement. Watson has now issued a statement. I'm just going to read in part from Watson's statement. I'm grateful that the disciplinary process has ended and extremely appreciative of the tremendous support I've received throughout my short time with the Browns organization. And it goes on. I should read this part. I apologize once again for any pain in this situation has caused. So when Watson says he's apologizing again, that's, at least by my count, the second time he's apologized, the first time being about 3 days ago. So certainly something has changed within the Watson camp where they're telling him it's okay to express some type of remorse. So, Dan, I wasn't as pointed with an 11-game prediction, which I will give you all the credit for. I didn't see anybody else calling their shot with 11. I said 10 to 12, and people that have listened to our podcast, and if you are coming in new and you have not listened to our show, we've been pretty clear that we thought that in order to avoid a federal court case, the suspension here in terms of games had to be less than a year. So for those not following the whole build-up to today, whether you want to believe the reports or not, the NFL had floated out, or someone on the NFL's behalf had said that the NFL was willing to accept a suspension for Watson before Judge Robinson's ruling, for as little as 12 games with some type of suspension. So Watson obviously didn't like that deal, wanted to take his chances with Robinson, who issued a 6-game suspension. And the NFL, to the extent they wanted to, could have pushed for a year or, which was being reported, an indefinite length of at least a year. So for Watson now to come out and settle for 11 games, his side can say it was a win. Hey, we didn't accept the 12 games, so we got an additional game back from Watson. In exchange, Watson is paying a $5 million fine. I saw I'm not sure if it was the official version, but there is some version out there floating out of an NFL release that he also has to seek some type of counseling, some type of NFL mandated sessions. So that would be similar to the Ben Roethlisberger case once upon a time. So, Dan, I'll give you all the credit for narrowing down to 11 games. But I'll ask you this. Are you a little disappointed that we don't get a federal court case out of this?
Oh, of course. I mean, we'd have this great content to talk about for the next 2 months. Of course, who wouldn't want to see this happen? But this is a real life situation. This is a player's livelihood. This is the Cleveland Browns business, and this is the passion and the zeal of the fan base that just wants to get on with the business of rooting for their team and having the games matter. I don't think fans root for litigation. It's just people like you and me who weigh in on these controversies. And while I'm sorry to see it go, I think this is a very just result on for all counts. Right, the NFL gets the most severe suspension in the history of the policy. Watson, importantly, gets to play this year and not run the risk of losing in federal court on appeal. Even if he were to win in the district court, he could end up being Tom Brady and serving his suspension the following year, which would mean he's missing games in 3 consecutive seasons. So it's a big win for him. And importantly, he gets to keep all but $5 million of that lucrative contract. I think he was able. I think what I alluded to last night on Cleveland.com is that I was being cynical, and I thought that Watson would trade games for money. And if he were to be able to keep more of his money, he'd be willing to increase the amount of the suspension he would serve. And I think the proof is in the fact that the fine is only $5 million, which is a very small fraction of his overall salary and certainly doesn't represent a normalized 11-game suspension. So he got off financially in very good shape. And one of the kickers to this deal was that the NFL and the Cleveland Browns are each going to contribute $1 million on top of Deshaun Watson's $5 million, and that this will, fund and support the work of nonprofit organizations across the country that educate young people on healthy relationships, promote education, and prevention of sexual misconduct and assault. If this is a legitimate press release and not some, fake press release where somebody slapped the NFL logo on a piece of paper and copied it. So
Pro Football Talk is saying that is accurate. That release is accurate. The NFL has not released it yet. We've tweeted that one as well, so you can check our respective feeds.
Yeah, and it's also a win in a way for Peter Harvey, who now doesn't have to have his objectivity called into question any longer, because if he were to have imposed a full year suspension, including the postseason, and given the NFL to the decimal everything that it had asked for, he would have been lambasted, at least by the Players Association and in federal court papers, as being nothing more than a lackey of the National Football League. So he gets to come out of this without having to do the hard work, and he keeps his reputation intact, at least from the perspective of challenges to his objectivity and partiality. And I think that's no small thing for Peter Harvey. And hopefully he got paid for writing a draft opinion, so he gets all of the fees associated with the work, but none of the accountability. So I think that's a win-win for him.
Okay, so I know we have some Cleveland fans in here, and to the extent you guys have a question, Mike, our lovely producer, Micah Lawson, is running the conduct account. So if you do have a question, raise your hand. We're happy to bring you up. So I'll be the one to say it. If the Cleveland fans want to get mad at me, they can. But while, Dan, you were speaking, I pulled out my calculator app on my phone. And what I did some really complex math. I took 11 games, right? I hit the division symbol, and I divided that by 4. And that math, very complex math here, works out to just less, about 2.75 games per sexual assault. So I know, Dan, you said, and I'm happy to, we can get into it, that it's a win-win for everyone. But there is certainly a contingency that's out here that's going to say, listen, 11 games might seem like a lot for one violation of the personal conduct policy. But let's not forget, Judge Sue Robinson, a former federal judge in Delaware, found that there were 4 counts of sexual assault. It was 4 for 4. The NFL only presented 4 women to Judge Robinson, and Judge Robinson found that all 4 were confirmed. And the standard she used was something called a preponderance of the evidence. It's a fancy way of saying more likely than not, a fancy way of saying for our sports betting people, like 51%. So that is the exact opposite of what 2 grand juries found in Texas. So, we can say 11 games is a lot and it's unprecedented, but we're dealing with, at least in my standpoint, right, and I think something the NFL might have been so inclined to argue, we did not see the NFL's papers on appeal, but that this could have been viewed as 4 separate violations of the personal conduct policy. And in 2022, right, if whatever math you want to do, 2.75, whether you want to round up to 3 or round down to 2.5, 2.5 games or 3 games per sexual assault could be viewed as still being very light. So I know, Dan, we had an extensive conversation on our podcast, right? Are we going to suspend him for all 20 different counts? Is that fair, that he could be out for years and years and years? I think that maybe is, it's an academic argument, but here we're dealing with 4. And that's, in some sense, the precedent that's being set. Sexual assault, sexual assault that occurred for Watson standard. I know I shouldn't have said precedent because we're dealing with a settlement and not an actual decision. But, right, when we're talking about this case moving forward, it's going to be viewed as, right, the version of sexual assault that Deshaun Watson committed resulted in suspension per offense that was somewhere between 2.5 and 3 games. So that's at least one way to read it.
You can't read it that way, because if all 25 plaintiffs had stepped forward and the NFL had brought them into the proceeding and proven the case, then he's suspended for 5 years. And I think the league has already set the precedent of not aggregating penalties for multiple offenses. I mean, in Sue Robinson's opinion on page 13, She points out that in the 3 instances in which prior cases involving nonviolent sexual assault or violent sexual assault led to suspensions in excess of 6 games, all of those involved multiple incidents of domestic violence, assault of multiple victims, multiple incidents of domestic violence again, and you're talking about, for at least violent conduct, a range of between 8 and 10 games. And if you're truly going to aggregate punishments based on a per assault basis, if you're starting with a baseline of 6 game suspension for violent sexual conduct, well, with a multiple instances or multiple victims, multiple incidents of domestic violence, then you're looking at 12 or more games if you're aggregating, and the league has never aggregated offenses. I think what it's done historically is enhance the punishment, not by using pure math, but just sort of almost like a not a multiplier, but an enhancement of some number of games, not based on 6 games per incident or X number of games per incident. So the league has already set the law of the shop, and they're not going to aggregate the punishment on a per offense basis and land at some ridiculously high number if you have.
Dan, I think your audio might have cut out. I'll just jump in here while Dan, you get your mic back on. I don't. I mean, it's not a ridiculously high number, right? To a certain point, it's just basic math. And just Dan, I'll fill in the blanks here, right? What we do not know, right? We do not know the dates associated with the 4 women who the NFL presented, right? We know that they are, at least the 24 women, the complaints that we did see filed in civil court, those were dates that ranged from, 2020 to early 2021. So, again, right, it is what it is. It's now at least, pending NFL confirmation, and maybe we're going to have that while we're on the Spaces, that's going to be written in ink. But I don't know if that's necessarily correct, the way the NFL viewed this, right? If you have an offense that occurred, I'll make up a date, right, in April of 2020, that's one of the 4, right? And the second of the 4 occurred in, we'll say September of 2020. And the other 2 occurred in, we'll say February of 2021. I don't know, just because the allegations might have something in common doesn't necessarily mean that you should view them as one giant violation of the personal conduct policy. And the other point we should mention, and I said a term which I probably shouldn't say, precedent, because precedent is never set when there's a settlement that's reached. Precedent's only going to be set by a judge or by someone in Judge Harvey's position that's ruling in an affirmative manner. And Dan, to your earlier point, and Dan, certainly just pop on once you have your mic figured out. But that's to Dan's point. It's not really precedent being set when the parties work out a type of settlement. It's just not going to be binding precedent. So maybe the NFL didn't want to have any precedent on the books for that specific reason. People have asked me why the NFL only presented 4 women and not the 24, or I think there was a 25th that at one point had filed an additional lawsuit, but I think she withdrew it when they asked to make her name public. And then there's also this numbers problem that 30 women have reportedly settled with the Houston Texans. So somebody had asked, right? And then I guess the other number, just to close the loop on our Deshaun Watson calculus problem, 66 women were alleged to have provided Deshaun Watson with massages in the last, I think over a 17-month period, as reported by, the New York Times. So the question is, right, if you really want to get to the truth of the matter, why doesn't the NFL present all 66 women, or all 30, or all 25, or all 24, or even, I think it was 12 that presented criminal complaints over in Texas? If you ask me, right, I mean, I know what's been reported. Pro Football Talk reported that the NFL picked 4 women in particular that I believe had some type of additional evidence. I think it was subsequent text messages with Deshaun Watson, just to, I guess, contemporaneous evidence, just to show that these women maybe had some more substantive evidence to prove that these occurrences existed. So that's what I saw. I have not heard it, directly from the source. But if they did, in theory, present all 24 women, all women that thought it was important enough to put their name to a lawsuit, right? The Deshaun Watson's campaign asked them to identify themselves. So could the NFL have used all 24 women? Sure, they could have. But then we'd be dealing with a very complex numbers problem, right? Where that basic math I just did, right? 11 games divided by 4 gave you 2.75 games. To Dan Wallach's point, I think Dan is trying to rejoin us now. To Dan Wallach's point, if the NFL had presented 20 women and had won, right, because they won on all 4 of the cases they presented to the NFL, then it's a much, much different problem. And I don't think we could as easily get away with, it's basically just one violation of the personal conduct policy, or it's 4, but we're not going to exactly call it that. Nobody, please guys, don't do the math, because then it doesn't make sense. I think the NFL, and at least the larger point I was getting at, you could talk about precedent, not precedent, but the math I did, right, and even the first math under Judge Robinson, a 6-game suspension divided by 4 games. Again, there are people, right, very smart people that can just say this is a game and a half per confirmed account of sexual assault by the impartially appointed judge. So there are certainly going to be some people that say it's light. But if we're just trying to, and as Dan and I said, and I went on Sports Grid TV this morning, I said probably it'll be between 10 and 12 games with some form of counseling and some sort of fine. That's, what we figured out, because the NFL, I think all reports that the NFL was pursuing a 1-year suspension with Peter Harvey, former New Jersey Attorney General. Now, he sits on the NFL's diversity committee. You kind of had a feeling where that was going. And the one thing that we've always said that Watson and the NFL had in common here is they wanted to put this thing in the past as quickly as possible. Maybe they didn't agree on a lot of things. They certainly agreed on putting this thing in the past. Watson could say he was going to make this thing very messy and take this to federal court. But as anyone can tell you, and I saw Fordham sports law professor Mark Conrad in the chat a minute ago, there's a lot of some very good history with respect to Tom Brady and Ezekiel Elliott. Courts are very hesitant to disturb the rules and decisions of a private organization absent some type of evidence or fraud. And at the end of the day, people can complain about this disciplinary process. That Judge Robinson, she found a 6-game suspension, and the NFL apparently could appeal to Goodell or a handpicked appointee. How is this system fair? Well, the NFL and the NFLPA agreed to it. So Watson, I think, knew, and as most attorneys or sports law professors in our space, said that Watson had, if you're a betting guy, right, Watson was a huge underdog to actually take this case on the merits to federal court. Could he have attempted to take the case up? Yes. Could he have made it very messy? Yes. Could he have continued this narrative and this loomed over the NFL for a full year like it did with Tom Brady? Yeah, it could have. And that was really the only leverage that Watson had left, right? That I can make this thing as messy as possible unless you're going to give me a favorable settlement here. So what does he walk away with? I think Watson was reported before the Sue Robinson decision, he was willing to accept a suspension as high as 8 games. The NFL was willing to accept a suspension as low as 12 games, but with a fine and counseling and whatnot. And we basically, shocker, we ended up with a number right in the middle of those two. So people can say that the process didn't work out. But if you just knew those two numbers ahead of time, 8 and 12, and it ends up at 11, it's not so much of a shock. So we can take a small victory lap, nothing so huge. I think Dan's having some tech issues. Does anybody else have any questions in the crowd? I see some of our listeners in here. I'm happy to answer anything. I'm trying to.
We do have one question. Michael DeLillo. I'm gonna bring you in now.
As Mike is getting brought up, Dan Wallach. I think just tweeted that he's having tech issues.
Hey.
So. I'm good, Mike.
Yeah. So I did want to ask. Dan kind of addressed it at the beginning that the NFL has something to hang its hat on here. That this is the largest suspension they've ever given, but that also kind of implies that they have to have something to hang their hat on. Because I think to most, like the layman, not sports law centric people, this is not going to look good for the NFL. I think based on your quick straw poll that you've done on Twitter, most of the responses are this is too light. And the discussion on precedent, I think, it kind of leads into, do you think that the main motivation for the NFL agreeing to a settlement of only 11 games, knowing how it would probably be viewed, is that they want to could they use this as fair notice, or is that one of the motivating factors, or was it more to avoid a federal lawsuit and to get the most, suspension, the largest suspension they've ever had for a nonviolent sexual offense? Because to me, it seems like if they knew they were going to have to fight this PR battle, the bigger motivation here is that they could use this to say, look, here is the new standard. Here is your fair notice that this is what could happen to you if this behavior happens in the future.
So a couple things, and I just put, Mike, I'm happy you referenced it. I shared the tweet up there, so it's a current poll we have going. Deshaun Watson discipline: 11-game suspension, a $5 million fine. The options, if anyone's reading it with me, are too light, too harsh, or just right. So, I just call it like I see it, right? I wear my lawyer hat, but I'm also, I feel like I have a pretty good sense of how Twitter was going to react. 70% said it was too light. So, Dan phrased this, and I think I understand why he said that. This is a win-win for the NFL, for the NFLPA, for Watson. But there is still a loud contingency online that's going to say, right, just do the basic math. 11 games is too light. Now, Mike, to your point, the specific point you raised, and it's unfortunate that Dan Wallach, is having some tech issues. But, Dan has been very adamant on this particular point. That fair notice, that Watson, that was going to be his argument if and when he took the case to federal court. And we had an interesting conversation. And first, for those that did not listen, I implore you guys to check out our podcast, Conduct Detrimental. Probably the most appropriate time to have a podcast named Conduct Detrimental, given it's essentially, Watson was suspended under the NFL's personal conduct policy. But here the argument was really, right, what Watson did, right, the NFL was trying to seek this unprecedented punishment for something that really has no precedent. So the question is whether there was fair notice provided to Watson by the NFL for this kind of offense, some type of nonviolent sexual conduct. So, that's something that Judge Robinson, it's kind of when you're dealing with an unprecedented case, you kind of have to make the law of the land. So Judge Robinson, we discussed it in the podcast, I think, attempted to bend over backward to shoehorn this case from a game perspective to find some type of precedent. So 6 games is an amount that's been used in NFL history before. Certainly this type of offense, and I'm not going to get into the kind of grosser details and allegations that are here, but this type of offense had never come up. Mike, I know you didn't ask it, but I'll try to get around it as sensitively as I can. What Watson was accused of, right? I know that under the NFL's definition of sexual assault, which they gave at the hearing, they weren't. I don't think it's not something that's contained in the personal conduct policy or whatnot. Judge Robinson felt that this conduct fell within the sexual assault definition, but also felt that this conduct didn't meet the definition of a violent offense. So, I think that what Dan was getting to, right? Violent, right? That's a term of art. I don't necessarily know what defines something as violent or nonviolent or not violent. If you implore anybody that's very interested in the case or any type of lawyers or law students that want to read the complaints here, I can make an argument that some of these acts were violent. I'm not sure which of the 4 of the 24 women were presented. I don't think we'll ever know that. The NFL has gone to great lengths to try to hide the identity of those 4. But at least some of those 24, it's not violent. It's pretty close to the line of violent. And then people, again, I'm not going to say it here. It's not my place to do it. But yeah, I mean, at a minimum, right? All 24 women were saying that something non-consensual happened. So whether you want to say it's violent, non-violent, I'm not sure where that gray area is. But Mike, to your point and to Judge Robinson's point, we're dealing in issues of gray, right? What at a certain point, sexual assault is by definition, right? If you say the word assault, I think people's imagery turns to some type of violent offense. So yes, you say it's sexual assault, but it's non-violent. So that's what leaves a lot to be desired. And that's what Judge Robinson's point, I think, is what she's getting into in her decision of lack of fair notice. Because we don't really know where this is, right? Is this fit in a clear-cut box of violent or non-violent? And it didn't really. So Judge Robinson said this is not the case to essentially give an unprecedented punishment when it's not really clear what box this fits in. And the NFL is trying to force into a box that has not yet been established. So, that's really where it got to. But at least my stamp on this, I think from from the lawyers negotiating a settlement, 11 games makes sense. But if you're just looking at a independent federal judge finding 4 counts of sexual assault, then you end up at 11 games, right? 2.75 games per sexual assault. I think it's totally fair that the poll is working itself out to say that 70% finds it to be too light. And as for the $5 billion, I mean, the guy just signed a $230 million guaranteed contract. So the guy's got $5 million and loose change sitting on his couch somewhere. So I know Dan said he would pay, he'd pay more money for less games or vice versa. money is really not an object to Deshaun Watson at this point. $5 million sounds like a lot, and I'm happy that's going to charity. It's not that much money for someone like Watson. Anybody else? If any other questions, I'm happy to kind of close the record here as we move on.
Yeah, Dan, we got one more question here. Looks like it's from Ani.
Hey guys, can you hear me?
Hey Ani, you're good to go.
Cool. It's sunny actually. It's a little weird. I use the lightning bolt for the S, but so
that, if anything, that would be.
Oh, okay. Well, anyways, so two comments. So one, I think, when you're doing the math on the suspensions, I think really the more clear-cut evidence is if you look at the Browns' schedule, after 11 games, week 12 is at his former team, the Houston Texans. So I think that's a money grab game for the NFL, and I think that may have played into the decision a little bit. I don't know if they can officially say something like that, but to me, I could see that being a marquee game for the NFL for all the wrong reasons. But my real question is the $5 million fine. I'm wondering how arbitrary that number is. Did Ezekiel Elliott get a fine for his suspension for domestic violence? Did Ben Roethlisberger get? And I know that was quite some time ago, but I'm just wondering where this fine kind of compares to some other historic fines.
I don't have the amount of fines. I do know because I looked at the case very closely. Roethlisberger was ordered to seek counseling, and again, the news is obviously just breaking. I have not seen the NFL's official release on this. This kind of draft version was leaked, draft or unconfirmed version said that was going to be ordered as well. So, as for the counseling, to the extent that's true, that does have some historical. Again, I don't want to say precedent, but it has been done before. The money, to your point, I think is arbitrary. I think they just found a number that made sense. I could call it pocket change for Deshaun Watson, but $5 million is life-changing money for all of us, every single one of us in the chat. So it is a lot of money, and it's not really fair to say, hey, Watson makes $230 million guaranteed, because keep in mind, right, Watson is making a $1 million, I think he signed a $45 million signing bonus. He's making $1 million this year, and then next year is that the contract starts to get backloaded. So I think they made that number up. I don't think there's any real reason for it. I will say, and I had a conversation with a friend at Fox Sports yesterday, who I'll spare his name, but we were talking about Judge Robinson's decision, which people tend to forget, right? In addition to the 6-game suspension, Judge Robinson, talking about what's arbitrary and what the judge has the freedom to do. Judge Robinson ordered Deshaun Watson basically like a restraining order from all non-team issued massages, which look at any type of real decision from a real court. You're never going to have that in there. So I imagine the NFL asked for it, which is surprising. So that didn't make its way, at least that language, into the press release that I found. So I'm not sure if that's still going to hold to the extent that Dan and we had an interesting conversation on the podcast whether Judge Robinson's 6-game suspension is being vacated, and now this 11-game suspension is being instituted, or if those finer points of the Judge Robinson decision are being kept, and then we're just tacking on, right, 5 additional games, $5 million fine, and then whatever other extracurriculars. Sonny, you had a good point, and I said it on Twitter, but I didn't say it here. Yes, it is bizarre that the way they work this thing out is for Watson to return in Week 13 to play the Houston Texans in Houston. Time permitting, I'm happy to get into it here if people want to hear it. But there is a long and we'll say a problematic role of the Houston Texans in this case. So I'm not sure why the NFL set it up for Watson to return and have his Week 1 game in Houston, right? And the way the schedule was set out this year, which I know they didn't mean to do because at that point, Baker Mayfield was still a member of the Cleveland Browns, but Week 1 was supposed to be Watson versus Baker Mayfield, which is another lightning rod of a ratings draw. So that game is not going to be as big of a draw as it once was. I haven't had the opportunity to check the lines. this suspension, there was a possibility, however remote, that Watson would file a temporary restraining order in federal court in order to play in that Week 1 game. With that potential in mind, the Browns were a +1 dog on the road in Carolina. I imagine that line has now since moved to maybe a point and a half, to still be the dog. But just to your point, the NFL, if they really were after ratings, they would have let Watson play in that Week 1 game and figured it out. But to the counterpoint, I don't know. I feel like you'd want to take him off the field for that game. I feel like Watson probably wouldn't want to be on the field for that game. It's probably, for our football fans, it's probably a win for the Cleveland Browns, no matter if Jacoby Brissett's a quarterback or Watson. But certainly that's going to set the stage. And if anybody watched the Jacksonville Jaguars preseason game against the Browns, again, I'm not my language to use here, but the Jaguars fans who have no affiliation whatsoever to Deshaun Watson, they let him have it from the crowd. Could you imagine the response and the reaction it's going to elicit from the Houston crowd? It's not great. And Mike, tell me if we have another question. I can't see it in the chat. The only other thing I'll add, and this is for I don't see any. I know we have some listeners that are pretty stout Texans fans. I don't see the few I'm looking for in particular in the chat. We just had about 2 weeks ago, and actually before I get to the Houston stuff, right now there is one civil case remaining filed against Deshaun Watson. One. So people are saying all the cases are settled. That is not true. There is one case that remains. It is an individual dating back to last year's trade deadline. There were reported to be 4 holdouts at the time there were 22 lawsuits that were filed. 18 of 22 were willing to settle. Last trading deadline, apparently there was some type of tentative deal in the works to send Deshaun Watson to Miami, which would have been a whole separate saga. But the Dolphins were reportedly asking that all 22 cases be settled. So there were 4 holdouts. And then fast forward, all but 4 of the cases were settled. I think it was like a month ago. And it was reported to be the same 4 holdouts that didn't want to settle last year's trade deadline. But Watson thought it was okay to settle basically all but 4 of those cases. Since that time, 3 of those 4 cases have settled. So there is some woman who is not named. I'm sure I could figure out her name from the active filings. I'm certainly not going to put her name out. But one person does not want to settle this case. So as long as one person's there, this case is still going to continue with a trial date scheduled right now, which is always subject to be adjourned and moved back. But right now it's looking at April of 2023. So the story is not over, right? And just before I get into the text and stuff, right? Again, I told you the numbers at the beginning of this call, right? That were 67 masseuses that were alleged to have given Deshaun Watson massages over that 17-month period, according to the New York Times. 30 women that had settled cases with the Houston Texans. Some of these incidents are alleged to have occurred in 2021. The statute of limitations, which is a fancy way of saying in legal talk, the deadline to sue, or the deadline for a case to be brought in Texas, the operative one that we've been working off is 2 years. So there's certainly a read on the situation where the statute of limitations has not run on more cases to be brought against Deshaun Watson, especially right when 30 women have settled with the Houston Texans and only 25 have ever filed lawsuits against Deshaun Watson. And for all the people that are sitting out here, right, those 66 or 67, whatever the number was, you're certainly going to have some of them, right, that didn't file lawsuits, that didn't settle with Deshaun Watson yet, or the Houston Texans, that are saying, wait, all these women just got paid. What's to stop me from doing it? And, right, very important here, the NFL personal conduct policy does not have any version of the statute of limitations or any version of a deadline to sue. It does not exist. So if any of these women were so inclined, right, who have not come forward in any way, shape, or form, and let's say for a hypothetical, as many of you guys know, I'm a sports law professor, a hypothetical, which I sometimes give my students. My sports law class starts in 4 days, so I have to get a little bit ramped up on these hypotheticals. If there was I'm going to call it a 31st person who had not settled with Watson or with the Houston Texans in any way, shape, or form, and they came forward with maybe some darker allegations, something that maybe we could all agree, right, could potentially be seen as being closer to that line of violent versus nonviolent, something that would be different. There's nothing stopping this person from coming forward, and let's say I'm going to make up a time frame, 4 years, similar to the time frame that Trevor Bauer's accusers over in baseball waited before Major League Baseball became aware of their claims. And this whole disciplinary process could, in theory, happen again a year or 2 years down the road. But that's the fear if you're Deshaun Watson or a Cleveland Browns fan, or you just want this thing to be done and you're just a fan of football and you just want to see get the story out of the headlines. That you're constantly, if you're Watson or his camp, looking over your shoulder because you don't know, right? I don't think he kept a comprehensive Excel sheet of every massage he ever got with people's contacts and social media handles. He's never going to know that, and unless all of those cases are settled, with some type of non-disclosure agreement or non-disparagement agreement, you never know if someone's going to come forward. So I'll add this kind of one final point. And Mike, you stop me at any point if there's a.
We have two questions, Dan.
Go ahead. I'll save my Texans commentary for later, but it's an interesting chapter. Go ahead.
It doesn't look like we can get Wallach back in. I don't know what's happening there, but I saw John Nucci come up first, so I'm going to bring up John, and then Evan Mattel has a question as well.
True.
Hey, John, you're up.
Can you hear me?
You're good, John.
Okay. So I have a question, kind of zooming out on this and looking at this entire process. And he was initially given a 6-game ban by a neutral arbitrator, and then the NFL just appealed, and then they were able to appoint their own person. So I guess my question is, has anything really changed with the NFL's, this punishment policy where Goodell kind of has complete authority and final say? Is this neutral arbitrator thing, is this kind of just a way to maybe put some pressure on the NFL? Or has anything really changed in that respect where Goodell is just the final arbiter and his decision rules?
So I don't know if this is good or bad. I try not to give hot takes, but I just try to call it like I see it. The 2020 CBA, I remember, and we covered in our show, we covered it online. That was everyone was claiming a victory, and they got it in under the wire, and it was ratified actually, when I say under the wire, under the COVID pandemic wire. So people were saying, oh, there's this new disciplinary procedure. It's great. It's an improvement over the old process. We're going to have an impartial judge. The only way the NFL can determine the suspension amount is if an independent judge actually finds there's a violation of personal conduct policy. So before I start bashing the system, it is an improvement because an independent judge has to find that the personal conduct policy was violated before Goodell could either appoint himself or his designee to up the suspension or modify it as they deem fit. So that's, it's an improvement. But let's say Judge Robinson, which didn't happen here, found 4 women were presented with sexual assault. I only found that violation. 1 sexual assault occurred. The other 3, I don't find that the NFL met their burden. I'm issuing a 1-game suspension. I'll make a number up. 2-game suspension, 3 games. It doesn't matter. The NFL could still, if they wanted to, right, up the number to a full year, right? They have the ability to do that. And that's the fear, right? When you have a Goodell or someone that they're handpicked designee, obviously you're bound by precedent to some extent, but there's what you can do, right, versus what the NFL will do. And, I was, as Wallach's point Dan made earlier, I'm sure there's a decision drafted by Judge, or I was going to call him Judge Harvey. He's not a judge, Peter Harvey. The only judge I know, Judge Harvey, is Steve Harvey, who is also not a judge, but point for a different time. But yeah, I'm sure there's a decision somewhere with Harvey trying to create precedent out of thin air. And that was always the fear in this case, that, when you're dealing with an unprecedented situation, normally you're going to get some type of unprecedented punishment, which Judge Robinson didn't really do. I kind of think, found a convenient number of 6, which is the number that the NFL loves to give out as punishment nowadays. And she kind of shoehorned her way in there. But, to your point, I don't want to bury this, right? What can the NFL and NFLPA do about this policy, which still gives the NFL a lot of control over this process? It lets the NFL solely pick either Goodell or their designee. That second decision to pick the judge, or I don't want to say the judge, but the decision maker, the NFLPA has no involvement in that. So Peter Harvey is someone that sits on the NFL's diversity committee. It's someone that handled the Zeke Elliott case in the past. And rest assured, right, if Peter Harvey would have given a bad finding for the NFL in the Zeke Elliott case, there's no way he's going anywhere near the Deshaun Watson case. So that's the fear. It's always the fear in these cases that if you decide against the NFL, maybe it could be great for the player, but that's going to hurt your wallet, right? To the extent that I'm sure Harvey's firm loves the publicity from this particular case, but you have a lot of incentive to decide, right? The expression, you don't want to bite the hand that feeds you, and that's still this incentive structure. John, the current CBA, I believe, expires in 2030. So, we're 2 years in. I imagine this policy is going to come up a lot. It's going to be a source of contention. This was the first time the system had come up. So Dan Wallach and I, the sports law nerds and us, we were excited to see if a judge would have potentially treated this case separately from the Brady and Zeke precedent, because it's not exactly the same structure, but in practice, we've kind of ended up there. But we're not going to see that. So the case doesn't really have any judicial testing on it. And the NFL's got to feel pretty confident in the absence of precedent that goes against them. They're going to feel pretty good that the Brady and Zeke Elliott precedent's still on point. And the looming prospect of losing, right, a protracted federal court case, that was, Dan and I spoke about it at length, that was always the motivation to settle for less than a year. Not to go down the rabbit hole, but just, whenever we do these, I have so much Watson random information in my head. Right? Watson is making a $1 million base salary for this year. So the Browns fans will tell you that that's just the way that they handle their contracts. I think the easy response is to say, well, sure, the $1 million might be a normal thing Browns do, but they certainly don't give out $230 million guaranteed to every player that walks in the door. In fact, no team has ever done that in history. So Watson's contract, $1 million base for this year, it's 45 or 46 next year, and then it continues to go up. So the contract is backloaded almost like no other contract in NFL history. So if Watson would have taken this case up, right, knowing that the Brady and Zeke precedent is the closest precedent on point, and those players lost, for potentially Watson to take this case up for a year while fighting to have the suspension held in abeyance pending the results of the case, there was always that universe where the suspension would have taken effect in 2023. In that sense, right, Watson's not losing, like a $50,000 game check for that $1 million base. He's losing seven figures every game he's missing. So from a financial perspective, it never made sense for him to take the case to federal court. And it could have, but it would have been a massive, massive risk to his wallet. So in addition to paying the attorneys, which I'm sure are charging him an exorbitant hourly rate, it was from no win proposition to potentially have the suspension go into effect in 2023. So it's a long and short way of saying the NFL knows that the system helps them right now. The absence of, they have two good cases on the point. They don't necessarily need a new case to tell them what we think we already know. So I don't think the NFL wanted this to go up on, to the federal court either. Long way of saying it, but I think that answered. So the short answer is 2030, and this system is going to be in place for a while, unless the NFL on their own makes an application, to change it. But I don't think they'd be inclined to.
All right, Dan, we have one more question, it looks like, from Evan Mattel.
I do know Evan. Evan is a friend of the show. And after Evan's up, I'll give my little Houston nugget as we move on to the next chapter of this case. But I'll save that for after Evan. But go ahead, buddy.
Hey, Dan. So I think the inevitable comparison after today is going to be Calvin Ridley and the full indefinite suspension for gambling. I know that the CBA says that the commissioner has full control over the punishment decided for gambling. Do you find that as a failure in the CBA's language compared to something like Deshaun Watson's case, or is that a failure on Roger Goodell's personal decision making?
Maybe both. I am happy you brought that up, right? So Calvin Ridley gets a 1-year suspension. Stephen Ross, which I'll talk about in a minute, he gets a 6-game suspension from the Miami Dolphins. There's DeAndre Hopkins gets a 6-game suspension for a positive test for performance-enhancing drugs. Ridley, obviously, sports betting. Stephen Ross, an allegation that he was tampering with Brady and Sean Payton. So, and then you end up with 11 games for Watson, who at a certain point we could say he was accused of sexual assault, but a judge found, right, that he committed 4 acts of sexual assault. Again, it's the complete opposite result that we had in the 2 Texas grand juries, but that's what we're dealing with, right? The NFL didn't make a suspension, actually didn't even put him on the exempt list because of the the allegations. They decided to suspend him only once a judge found that sexual assault occurred. So, to your point, Evan, and for those that don't know, Evan is our site editor for conduct-mental.com. So obviously, Evan had to come with a very good question. It's all over the place, right? There is no rhyme or reason to these amount of games, and certainly the easy point to say is that Ridley was not punished under the NFL's personal conduct policy, right? Stephen Ross, tampering is very different than sexual assault. And then, if you want to make things even more complicated, right, Robert Kraft, the owner of the New England Patriots, had his own allegations of massages, right? And people, again, not my place to bring it up here, people can Google it. We're trying to find a similar case that has occurred in NFL folklore, and the owners are supposed to be held to the same personal conduct policy that Deshaun Watson is being punished under. I don't know. It's not that crazy to say that, hey, maybe it's not the most fair thing for Watson to get 11 games when Bob Kraft got 0, right? And to a certain point, they're both allegations, right? I don't think, obviously, no judge ruled on the Kraft case, and Kraft's case ended up getting thrown out on a technicality on a bad subpoena, but neither here nor there. But I think that argument, Evan, that you just brought up, like this varying, wildly different treatment of suspensions and this owner punishment that I'm bringing up, that I think was the NFL's fear, right? That this case or this disciplinary hearing leaves the confines of the NFL, their safe space, right? The safe space of Judge Robinson, where, I'd love to have seen the NFL and the NFLPA's briefs. I'd love to have seen them. We're never going to see them. I'd love to have seen the NFL and NFLPA's appeal papers. We're never going to see them. My gut has always been that Bob Kraft argument, something along those lines, is what Watson was prepared to argue. Be it Bob Kraft, be it Dan Snyder, Jim Irsay, you go through. There are owners that have had issues, allegations, whatever you want to call it, but bad stories, who never were suspended for 11 games, let alone a year, right? This is not Donald Sterling's NBA, right? This is the NFL, which we've never seen something rose to the level of Donald Sterling. Maybe Jerry Richardson could have got there, former owner of the Carolina Panthers, but he sold the team very quickly. So, yeah, I think that was the NFL's MO, right? We talked from Watson's perspective. His only leverage, as far as I'm concerned, I think he knew he had a losing case at the federal court level, but he could have made this case as messy as possible. And not just the fact that he filed it and the case existed for longer, that it existed in the background for a year and it muddied up the NFL. To Sonny's point, and it was a good one that he raised before, right? I don't know, there's going to be more attention paid to Watson games, so it's not really a ratings issue, it's an optics issue. The NFL, I don't really think is as concerned with this case floating on in the background as much as they are these federal briefs being filed on a system, for any of our lawyers here, that any lawyer can access with the Pacer account, right? I could have accessed them unless they had some type of sealing order on the docket, which they might have had, but that's the fear, that maybe the judge file or the court clerk files something wrong, and then all of a sudden we see access to some of the NFL's best kept secrets, which is, we talked about it on our podcast last night. We did a Trevor Bauer segment. Somebody filed something in court a week ago, a Trevor Bauer counterclaim, and we found out a lot of information that was not publicly reported previously about one of Trevor Bauer's older accusers. I think when he was with the minor league affiliate, if it's the Columbus, I can remember the team, but it's the Guardians minor league affiliate that he was with once upon a time. There's some older allegations. So that's the fear. When the case actually gets to real court, I'm not going to call it kangaroo court, but kangaroo court, football court, this is not a real legal proceeding. This is a private rules, anything kind of goes, right? Goodell's handpicking the person deciding the case. That's not really that fair. But I think that was the NFL's fear. Win or lose, that Watson could have made the case very messy. So people, I'm getting some DMs. Why did the NFL feel inclined to settle the case? I don't think they necessarily care about preserving the relationship with, Deshaun Watson, the NFLPA, right? Those guys are going to go to war all the time. But I'm sure they do care about protecting the interests of the owners, right? The 32 NFL owners are really who runs the league. It's not Roger Goodell. It's not the lawyers who are representing the NFL. It's the NFL owners are the clients. And to the extent that some owners were being mentioned, right? Jerry Jones has separate, bad news stories. People can Google those. That would be the fear. If this case with such a high profile magnitude comes out and Watson, who It's hired some of the best sports lawyers in the country. Jeffrey Kessler, people can look him up. He had the NCAA versus Lawson case, number of high-profile cases. If the NFL really wanted to call Watson's bluff, one really bad, legal brief, and I'm saying bad legal brief, but a very well-written legal brief that paints the NFL in a bad light, I'm not sure how much that PR is worth. But for Watson to go into the night, the NFL looks like they got to win because they forced. Looks like, again, we'll see if the NFL confirms it. But these counseling sessions, $5 million to charity, 11-game suspension. It's unprecedented. Both sides can paint this as a win. So, again, for those joining late, that's why that number, 11 games, was what Dan and I predicted. I said 10 to 12. Dan nailed it at 11, so he gets all the credit. That number made sense because it's a number that both sides can use as a win. It falls in that sweet spot. Mike, any more questions, or should I give my final Texans rant? And I see Darren Heitner has joined. Darren, I'm giving a preview to the lecture I'm going to give to your class tomorrow, so apologize if any students are getting the advance notice. Mike, tell me if we have any questions, or else I'll end with the Texas stuff.
No other questions that I see.
Was that someone has a question, or was that
No, it looked like Darren Heitner gave you like a high five. He gave you a emoji.
Okay, so I'll end with this. So there are going to be a lot of people, and maybe people that got their law degrees from Twitter University, Twitter University School of Law. I shouldn't slander Twitter University. Twitter University I have no issues with. Twitter University School of Law, separate issue. They're going to say this is over. It's in the past. We don't have to worry about this anymore. And if you were a certain ESPN reporter, I think the comment was, the truth has come out, right? So you can't say those things, right? Because we don't know what the story is written, is being written, and it's still being written. One civil active case, we still have not seen the expiration of the statute of limitations, even from the last date that we know of in 2021. So you still could have more criminal complaints or civil complaints that are filed here. So everybody hold their horses and put in the ink there, right? Write this in pencil, and then you can kind of adapt. The one piece that is not being discussed enough is this kind of Houston Texans investigation, allegation, whatever you want to call it. Mike Florio, who people know Pro Football Talk, Mike is a former lawyer. I don't know if he still practices. Maybe someone can correct me on that. I don't think he still does. But he reached out in his capacity now as a member of the media, former lawyer, and he asked the NFL, this is from a tweet of his a couple weeks back, is there an open investigation into the Texans? And the NFL, at least according to Florio, was being very coy and didn't give a firm answer to that. We just saw about, my dates are, sports law is all blending together, but it was within the past month. The Miami Dolphins got hit with their version of an unprecedented punishment for, they called it tampering. I think it was probably a combination of the tampering and the bribery allegations, but story for another day. That investigation is I knew the NFL announced it because it happened, the allegations were brought on by the Brian Flores class action discrimination lawsuit. And in the wake of that lawsuit, and people know, right, Brian Flores was alleging he was offered $100,000 per game to lose on purpose. So, and he also had allegations about tampering with an unnamed quarterback who turned out to be Brady, but people know that story. That they announced an investigation, and then 6 months passed, maybe more than that, maybe 8 months passed. And then all of a sudden, I don't know, it was right in the middle of the Deshaun Watson story, this unprecedented punishment going towards the Miami Dolphins. Okay, so what happens with the Houston Texans? Why is that Week 13 game probably more meaningful than people are even going to give it credit for? The Houston Texans were alleged in that really, I think it was Jenny Varentis with the New York Times. She alleged two things of note in that story, and it was a long one, so we don't read the whole thing. There's the 2 points to take away with. 66 masseuses in a 17-month period is a crazy number. That's what was reported. The other part of that I believe was previously unknown was the Houston Texans' alleged role with Deshaun Watson. Okay, so I'm going to stop there for a second, and I'm going to fast forward. The Houston Texans traded Deshaun Watson for 3 first-round picks. They received 3 first-round picks, and then Deshaun Watson signed a $230 billion guaranteed contract, which we got a lot into. So that's quite the haul for the Texans. It's great for Deshaun Watson. The week or two before the grand jury came back, or the first grand jury came back, I read reports, and I'm sure people can find them on Twitter, that there was some rumbling that if Watson was charged with or came out of the grand jury proceedings with a felony, that was on the table, that he could have been released. So the Texans very quickly went from having their prized asset released, and then he was cleared on the indictment, the first indictment, not the second. Second one happened in the middle, but then in the middle of those two indictments is when this trade happened for the 3 first-round picks, and Watson got $230 million. So the Texans went from like leaving empty-handed, and everyone's saying, "Why didn't you trade him during the entire year where he wasn't on the exempt list? Why didn't you trade him?" To making out with kind of like a king's ransom for Watson. So now back to the allegations, right? The New York Times reported that early on, before we knew about all these cases, that I don't know if it was one of the people that sued, but it was a female that Watson allegedly got a massage with, posted on social media something along the lines of like, "I'm going to, the gist of the allegations that I'm going to go public with this and whatnot," but it was posted on social media. So in that New York Times story, and this is pre-March of 2021 when we started finding out about all these cases. So we've covered this case in the podcast for like a year and a half, literally. So on all these twists and turns we follow, but not everybody was necessarily onto the case for that long. So I guess somehow this came to light, whether Watson told the team or the team found out about it by monitoring social media, I'm not sure. But the Texans, according to this New York Times report, their response was not like, "Let's go and run and get Watson to stop doing these acts." The allegation that occurred from that was assigned or attributed to Texans is that the head of their security, which is a former Secret Service member, ended up placing a non-disclosure agreement in Deshaun Watson's locker. And Watson, according to later deposition testimony, has acknowledged this fact, that he was given an NDA by the Texans in that same time frame after that first individual came forward on social media, and that Watson then used that NDA for subsequent massages or with different women, with different masseuses. So if people don't know what an NDA is, it's a fancy way of saying, right, like, this is an agreement. You are not allowed to speak about what's going on in this massage, at least for this particular context, or else there's some type of financial penalty. It's usually how NDAs are crafted. So, okay, that's the allegation, that the Houston Texans gave him an NDA not to stop these acts from occurring, but almost to kind of facilitate them. So among a number of allegations that were addressed in that New York Times story, right, this was this big Houston Texans one. The Houston Texans maybe helped Deshaun Watson do this. And then you wonder, okay, well, the Texans didn't play him the entire last year, so there might be some people in the chat that are like, well, he was on the exempt list, so they couldn't play him. False. Well, he was suspended last year, so they couldn't play him. False. He was completely eligible to play. Roger Goodell said as much and confirmed that. This is back in October. I was just looking at these old news reports, but in October of 2021, 6 months into when we knew about all the worst stuff of the complaints, right, all these bad allegations, that Watson was eligible to play, and they didn't have enough to put him on the exempt list. So then you have to wonder, okay, I don't know what more the NFL needed to know. It's a separate soapbox I can get on with Roger Goodell. But the question is, right, which I don't know the answer to, and the New York Times story didn't speak about it, and the NFL is certainly being very coy about it. What did the Texans know? Were they fully forthcoming with the NFL about what they knew about Deshaun Watson then? And if they were, why wasn't Deshaun Watson suspended then, right? Similar question. Were the Houston Texans forthcoming with information that they knew when they were in trade conversations with, I think it was the Atlanta Falcons, New Orleans Saints, and obviously the Cleveland Browns? Were they forthcoming with information at that point? It's a fair question, right? We don't know those answers, but certainly we brought this up on the podcast a few times, and even again, kind of last episode. The question is, if the Cleveland Browns knew of all of the stuff that would happen, right? There would be, I think, 2 more lawsuits that were filed. The Houston Texans would get brought into a lawsuit. The Houston Texans, mind you, would settle with 30 women, right? So the Houston Texans, I don't know, I'm sure they signed a general release that said they admitted to no fault and all that fun stuff, which you normally would see in a release. They still paid 30 women off, right? 5 more women than had ever sued Deshaun Watson. So the chapter in the Houston Texans involvement that book has not yet been closed. So, I put it there, right? The Cleveland Browns, the question is, if they knew all of this stuff would happen, right, would they still have parted with 3 first-round picks to the Houston Texans? and paid Deshaun Watson $230 million for this black eye of PR that has hit them and will continue to hit them, right, for the next couple of weeks. It will ramp up as we get close to week 13. And, we saw what the Jaguars fans did in week one of the preseason with the chance to Watson. And again, people can Google it. But Watson's going to face that in every arena he goes to for the rest of the season. It's going to very closely resemble, at least, when I grew up, and I don't want to get so much into the weeds, but I remember going to Nets games as a young kid, and the fans would chant stuff like "wife beater" at Jason Kidd, and I'm sure it was really hard for him to perform under those levels. I think Watson's going to face that. So the question is, did the Cleveland Browns, from a due diligence standpoint, the Cleveland Browns said, we did our due diligence into Deshaun Watson. The question has always been to me, and I've never gotten a firm answer from this, and I don't even know which is better, right? Did the Cleveland Browns just not know? Did they not know all these potential things? Did they not speak, to all of the accusers, which there was a lot of reports that from the accuser's attorney, this guy by the name of Tony Busby, who, again, another rabbit hole we can get down. He represented all 24 women that have filed lawsuits against Deshaun Watson. Separate wormhole, which we're happy to go down if anybody has any questions afterwards. But Busby said that he never spoke with any team, let alone the Cleveland Browns. So the question is, right, did the Cleveland Browns know of all this and do it anyway, or did they not know? And the question is, if they did not know, right, did the Houston Texans kind of withhold certain information? So I'll leave that there. I know I've been blabbing for a while. I had to filibuster a lot of time because of my fellow Dan's tech issues, but that's the bookend. So again, one civil case remaining. You still could have more that are filed. You still could have more disciplinary NFL proceedings down the line if more cases, maybe of a different character and nature, come forward. And the fourth one, which I'm watching very closely. The Houston Texans are not out of the doghouse, so to speak. The NFL has not cleared them. The NFL has not neither denied or announced an investigation into them. But we are coming off of a 2022, we're halfway through the year, where the Washington Commanders, right, they had an investigation into the team. The Miami Dolphins, an investigation into the team. I don't know if it's an active investigation with the Raiders, but they had their own different stuff, I think, with the general counsel leaving and different stuff went over with the Raiders situation. But across sports, we covered a lot on our show, right? Be it the Phoenix Suns or the Portland Trail Blazers. The NFL is not in the business of not investigating the team. The question is what the results of that investigation will be. So, yeah, I mean, those are your four narratives to look moving forward. And I'm not, I'm not in the business of just telling you random things and just say, hey, this is over. The case is in the books. It's not. There's a lot more to still be decided. So,
Dan, let me pitch another question to you.
Talking about to wrap it up so cleanly, Mike. Okay, go ahead.
No. Talking about the Cleveland Browns and their due diligence moving forward, Darren Heiner, he's not in here anymore, but he just sent out a tweet not too long ago talking about the requirements to limit Deshaun Watson's massage therapy to club-directed sessions and club-approved massage therapists for the duration of his career, and that this release is silent on that issue,
right?
And whether or not that needs to be a requirement moving forward, and if not, should the Browns have the due diligence to make sure that happens?
Oh, Mike, okay. We have a lot of people here, so I'm going to get nerdy with you for a second. I alluded to it very quickly, but whatever. Well, we're here. We're here, so I guess sports lawyers will be nerdy. I'll wear the hat for a second. Dan and I had a very nerdy back and forth off the podcast, offline, and we don't always disagree. We disagreed on this particular point, and it's because it's a new CBA, it's a new system. The question is whether that decision from Judge Robinson is still effective at all, period, or if the NFL has essentially, right, the suspension, this news of the settlement has vacated Judge Robinson's prior order, decision, whatever you want to call it, and now we're just dealing with whatever the terms of the NFL's release are, which I haven't had a chance to look at to the extent it came out. And if it has come out, Mike, certainly we can address it. But where I don't know. So I guess I'll stop here for a second. So the NFL's language speaks about the NFL can modify the punishment, or I don't want to say the NFL, but the person sitting in Peter Harvey's shoes can modify the punishment that's issued at the initial level. So I don't really, modify to me could mean a lot of things. Does it mean that the 6 games, and obviously this condition about this is, therapy or the therapist, is it vacated, or are we again tacking on to the top? Dan Wallach seemed to think that it was tacked onto the top. Now, I'm not sure if that changes, and I don't want to speak for Dan, with there being a settlement reached and not an actual decision from Harvey, right? The fact that it's a settlement could mean that both sides are wiped. But I was of the opinion that I think there's a reading, if I'm Deshaun Watson's camp, that if I was taking this case to federal court, I would have asked for a temporary restraining order to have allowed Watson to play in week 1 and saying, no, the Harvey, in theory, in this hypothetical world, gave him a year suspension. So it didn't say 6 games and then add on the rest of the season. 6 games that Robinson gave plus whatever I'm giving him right now. It said 1 year. And certainly it's a hypothetical, which didn't happen. But I said in that world, right, Watson can appeal the entire thing. It's not broken up in such a neat way. So, yeah, the short answer to your question, Mike, is it's unknown. That's why I think the NFL press release is going to tell us a lot. And if Watson is still ordered to stay away from anyone else other than, club issued therapist, I would think that would be in the NFL's release. My gut is that if it's not included in the release, is that it's not applicable. But I don't know, as a non-legal advice, some advice to Deshaun Watson, right? I don't know why you would go to anyone else other than the club-issued masseuse. And that has nothing to do with these allegations, right? The team hires the best masseuses in the world, traveling with you wherever you go. And the point that I didn't raise here, but I've said in the past, right? 66 masseuses in a 17-month period. Oh, by the way, that 17-month period occurred during a pandemic, which probably already wasn't a safe thing to do, independent of potential legal liability. So, I think Watson's learned his lesson. That doesn't have to be in writing for Watson for something that he should adhere to. One other note, Mike, and then tell me if we have any other questions. Before Judge Robinson issued her decision, we did a podcast. Landis is not on here, but I did a podcast with Landis Barber, one of our contributors, and we had just seen news of the Kyler Murray contract. And the Kyler Murray contract at the time, they've since taken out that clause, but it required Kyler Murray to do like 4 hours of film study a week. And I joked, and I'm like, wow, if the Cleveland Browns saw that, they definitely should have put a massage clause in Watson's contract. That would be a no-brainer. Probably pretty bad that they didn't do it. And then Robinson reached out, and Robinson issued her decision, which had a version of that in it. I think it's to all parties' interest for Watson to only use club-issued therapists, but I don't really think it's something that needs to be put in writing. And if it does, and if Watson's really fighting to have that removed, it's kind of it's a weird look. So let's see. I think it's kind of a moot point. It should be in the NFL's release. If it's not, my gut is that it's not effective. But NFL or NFLPA would have to comment on that. Mike, any further questions?
No other questions.
Okay. Cheap plugs on the way out. Conduct Detrimental is our podcast. We record twice a week. We're probably going to do an emergency episode on this, so certainly rate, review, subscribe, follow us if you have not already. Dan Wallach is at Wallach Legal. He's my co-host. And yeah, we are both sports law professors in addition to being practicing full-time attorneys. So yeah, we cover all things sports and law, not just football. But we tend to cover more football than most with Snyder and Flores and you name it, we cover it. But certainly the recent live golf stuff we've covered, the Trevor Bauer stuff, the Ben Simmons grievance. We try to cover a little bit of everything. And then a special guest this week we had on Freezing Cold Takes, a friend of ours, former lawyer, which people do not know. Fred Siegel has a book that came out. So our podcast just released this morning. Certainly check it out. And if you ever have any questions moving forward, you can always DM me. I try to respond to everyone. Sometimes I'm a little bit slow. But don't worry, I will not charge you my hourly fee. I will just try to answer questions, but can't give legal advice, but I'll try to answer questions as best as I can. Okay, so with that said, I'm Dan Lust, again, for Dan Wallach and myself. And if you missed the entirety of this episode, we're going to put the audio for our episode that'll come out, I think either later tonight or tomorrow, but we're just going to drop this audio in. So if you came in late, don't worry, we're going to have this available for everyone. If you subscribe to the podcast, you should get it there. Again, that's Conduct Detrimental, wherever podcasts are heard, and we thank you so much for listening to this. And stay tuned for more Deshaun Watson and more sports law coverage from us. Thank you, everyone, very much. I appreciate it.
So for those wondering where Dan Wallach went, we were as well. This is a quote from Dan Wallach on Twitter right after he dropped that. He tweeted this, quote, "Sorry I dropped off the Twitter Spaces. Can't log back in. Left on a high note," smiley face. I like that Dan put a smiley face. I'm not sure if Dan was actually smiling when he wrote that. He was very frustrated with the text. But listen, we got a podcast. The show must go on. We call the Twitter Spaces live for 12:15. We got to roll. And this podcast, Dan and I are now in very different time zones, but we got to make it happen. So yeah, if you want Dan's takes on the subject, he is all over the place, posting his hits for Cleveland.com. He's posting long threads. And Dan, Dan's been pretty good for writing for ConductDetrimental.com. I leave that to our many writers around the country, but Dan's articles, when he puts them up, probably our most read content on the site. So certainly check that out. He has his most recent Watson piece pinned to his feed. Okay, speaking of quotes, Mike, let me give it to you. We heard from Watson. We heard from the Haslams. We heard from Tony Busby. We heard from his agent, Watson's agent. We heard from everybody. What do you got?
All right, I'm going to jump into the press conference that was happening while we were in the Twitter spaces. I was monitoring the spaces from the podcast account, and then I was trying to scroll through Twitter to see any updates. And I noticed that they were doing the press conference with the Browns owner, Jimmy Haslam, and they were asking him many, it was all Deshaun Watson. That was the entirety of the press conference. And I think something that really stood out to me was they asked him, I don't even know if it was a posed question. I think it was basically Jimmy said that if he was to do this all over again and he had all the knowledge he knows now about Deshaun Watson, would he still make that trade? And he said yes. He's like, I would absolutely do it. Absolutely would do it. He was talking about giving people second chances. He said he's like, in this country, people in this world, deserve second chances, comparing the situation from Watson to Kareem Hunt, saying, we gave Kareem Hunt a second chance. Obviously, Kareem Hunt, if you didn't know about that, there was a TMZ video where Hunt was shoving and kicking a woman, which ultimately led to Kansas City releasing him. Cleveland then later signed in 2019. So it appears that the Browns really didn't show any remorse. However, there is a statement that was made by the one and only Deshaun Watson, which, Dan, I'm going to kick it to you exactly what he said, but you talk about no remorse. I mean, this is it.
Well, I just wanted to add on Kareem Hunt. If anybody wants to watch the video with Kareem Hunt, there is no video, obviously, with Deshaun Watson. You call it a push and a kick. The video is what is alleged and what's depicted on the video is nowhere near what Deshaun Watson was accused of. So it's apples and oranges. And great example for Kareem Hunt. Kareem Hunt has just demanded a trade out of Cleveland. So probably a better guy you could have used the example of. And, that's for the Haskins point. So we could talk about Deshaun Watson. I mean, it's very different. What he wrote, and I just did a radio hit for one of the shows. And I said, what he writes, I don't really have an issue with. It's very curated. There's nothing wrong. It's the lawyers are saying that. But when you play the game of telephone, when the lawyers prep him on what to say versus what he actually said, he runs into problems. Watson basically said he stands on his innocence, right? And then he said in his press conference that he wants to apologize because there were some people that were triggered. So I'm like, okay, he stands on his innocence, so he didn't do anything wrong. Got it. But he wants to apologize to the people that were triggered. So I don't know who he was apologizing to. Was he apologizing to the Browns? No, I don't think so. Was he apologizing to the accusers? No, because he's saying some people were triggered. His first apology said he wants to apologize to the women, to the people that were impacted. So, Watson is walking a very fine line of showing remorse versus actually saying he did something wrong. So again, just so people know where at least I stand, I am not one that is clamoring for this Deshaun Watson apology. As far as I can tell, like Mike, you and I are big, combat sports fans, at least recently. I've become a combat sports guy, right? It's almost a split decision. You had the grand juries come out on Watson's side. They say that no misdemeanor, no felony, sexual assault occurred. The judge comes in and says that sexual assault occurred. So Watson, he can make an argument, at least to himself, when he looks in the mirror and say, hey, I didn't do anything wrong. His grand jury said I didn't do anything. And Watson's agent came out and basically bashed Judge Robinson today for saying that she had made up her mind because she read the NFL papers weeks before Watson put in his papers. So I guess from Watson's perspective, he is still saying he's innocent. He is not, he's saying he's apologizing, but he's not apologizing to anyone really in particular. And he keeps saying that he's never shown anything but respect to women. So it's tough. I don't know why Watson needs to say all of the above. He can claim his innocence while apologizing to the Browns for putting him through this situation and putting himself in a situation where you're using 66 different masseuses in a 17-month period. I mean, I don't know. That's pretty bad.
This isn't the end of it either. There's still one case. There's still one civil case that he hasn't settled. He only settled 23 of the 24, and there could be more that come out of the woodwork.
And he was asked very pointedly, are there other cases that are out there that the public doesn't know about? And we've been on the show a million times. So for any of our new listeners, welcome. The Texans settled 30 cases with 30 different women. Deshaun Watson has only been sued by 25 different women. So certainly there could be 5 more people that never filed a lawsuit. They settled the cases pre-suit, so we never heard about them. But I would find it almost impossible for 30 women to settle with the Texans, who are basically brought into the case on a vicarious liability theory. That's when you sue someone's employer because of the acts of the employee and they don't sue or go after the employee. That doesn't make any sense. I would say conservatively, there are 5 cases that we don't know about. If you're just doing basic math, the 30 Texas cases minus the 35 that have sued him directly. And people are saying 24, 25. There was one woman who voluntarily discontinued her lawsuit because she did not want to announce her name. So that's where we're at. But I don't know, Mike, that's Deshaun Watson, unless you have the specific quotes. I mean, that's the gist of it.
It just didn't show any sign of remorse.
So we covered Haslam. We covered certainly Deshaun Watson. Let's talk about Deshaun Watson's agent's response there. He had 2. One tweet that remains up and one tweet that was deleted. Mike, deleted tweet first or the tweet that's still up?
Tweet that's still up.
Okay. Quote, Deshaun has always stated he is innocent of sexual assault. Nothing has changed in what he said. He also said he is remorseful. The decisions he made have created this situation. The settlement allows him to move forward with his life and his career. So let's fact check a couple of things. The settlement doesn't really allow him to move forward with his life and his career because there's still some other things floating out there, right? There's still 66 masseuses in a 17-month period, which the NFL has no version of a statute of limitations to come forward. We don't want to beat the horse that we talked about it 100 times. So the problem is, if you're just trying to figure out why the statement why the agent had to say anything, because Watson half apologized, half didn't say he was showing more, said he stands on his innocence. So it wasn't really clear what he was saying. So, Mulugeta is filling in the blanks. Nothing has changed in what he said. He also said he is remorseful. Decisions he made have created this situation. Watson didn't say that. His agent had to say it. So whatever. Your agent, you pay them the big bucks, I guess, to speak on your behalf sometimes, right? Deshaun has always stated he is innocent of sexual assault. He has always said that, but it's tough. It's tough to make an apology, right? And Mike, in Watson's statement, he said, I'm apologizing again. So not sure you could show remorse without apologizing. So I don't know. I don't want to get into semantics, but Watson's trying to play this PR dangerous game. And I think you got to give Watson failing grades. Every time there's a microphone put in front of his face, the Haslam's face, I just think they keep falling all over themselves. That's just my personal standpoint. The deleted tweet, I thought was interesting. So this one, quote, to be clear, comma, Judge Robinson repeated the NFL's narrative. She received a brief from the NFL weeks before we had the opportunity to talk to her. In our first call with the judge, she referred to, quote, Deshaun's pattern of behavior. Her mind was made up before we ever presented a counter. I don't know why that was deleted. I just pointed out, call it like we see it. Deshaun's pattern of behavior is not a subjective term, right? There are 24 women that are alleging a pattern. It's not the judge coming up with that. It's just facts. If 24 people allege something to have happened, they're alleging a pattern to have occurred. So I don't know. Some things I think are better left unsaid. I think every time the Browns hold a press conference, they just go 3, 4, 5 steps back. Whatever came out, the settlement happened. It is what it is, right? I don't know why everyone feels the need to keep chiming in on this, but it is what it is. I don't know, Mike. Do you have anything to add on the agent's comments?
We're seeing visceral reactions from everybody involved here. Like I said earlier, that the settlement was obviously disagreed upon by both sides, yet this was some sort of amicable middle ground that people can just move forward. But I think if you want to also talk about a pretty visceral reaction, you have to go to Tony Busby. We've talked about Busby a number of times on this podcast and how open he was in social media. Rusty Harden accusing him of trying to try this in the public eye and using social media to attack Deshaun Watson. But this was a comment from Tony Busby on this matter. So by settling this matter the way he has, Roger Goodell has proven one of 2 things. Either his recent rhetoric was utter baloney, or his bark is much worse than his bite. My belief is that he is nothing more than a paper tiger. The message today to all victims is clear. If you believe you have been sexually assaulted by a powerful person, keep your mouth shut and go away. The NFL has certainly demonstrated that its ownership and the organization doesn't care. To all sexual assault survivors, do not allow this recent, quote, punishment, end quote, to deter you. Keep speaking up and keep speaking out. Your voice matters. You are making a difference. We stand with you. Now, 2 things. Obviously, that's when I read that and saw that's he's clearly talking about what's happening with Watson, but you also can't not think about what's happening with the Washington Commanders. I mean, everything that's happening with Dan Snyder and the situation there and how the NFL is handling that too. So I imagine it's kind of coming from both sides. And I also imagine that most of the people involved with the Washington Commanders are seeing what's happening with Watson and seeing how the NFL is handling that too. So there's a lot of uncertainty, I think. People were maybe just happy that this is over, but at the same time, people are now talking about what does this do for precedent moving forward. Dan, you talked about it on the spaces that it was basically roughly 3-game suspension per victim. It's interesting where the NFL goes from here. I think the Browns are just going to be in for it this year. I think, even freezing cold takes when we had Fred Siegel on the last podcast, he talked about the Browns are going to go through it. They're going to have these types of reactions against them. So time will tell.
So much for Busbyisms. He's kind of gone back into, normal legal territory without resorting to breaking news on Instagram. But
utter baloney,
right? I did find, at least as I read the comments, right? Busby is the attorney for all 24 of the women that had filed lawsuits. 25, I guess, if you want to talk about the one woman who withdrew her case. All the women that have filed lawsuits, Busby has represented. So, with respect to a settlement, usually an NDA is going to prevent the parties or the litigants to the case to talk poorly about one another, talk about any type of settlement. So there's a non-disparagement agreement or a non-disclosure agreement. It's usually a proper agreement or a confidentiality agreement, whichever way you want to call it. It's going to have elements of all three, right? You can't talk about it. If you talk about it there, or if you speak badly about the other side, there are some issues. So if you read that statement, Watson, it's almost Busby is talking about Goodell being toothless. He's not really going after Watson, which is interesting. I would find it odd that any settlement would not similarly, or there would be a conversation amongst attorneys, hey, we're settling these cases, Busby, you shouldn't be able to talk about them anymore. So, I do note that. And again, we talked about in the spaces, but there's a lot of things that are a lot of still remaining loose ends. So if you're a Browns fan, you listen to this, Deshaun Watson, you're in a dynasty league and you have Deshaun Watson, I would constantly be concerned that something could happen, right? And the statute of limitations has not yet run for the civil cases, still could see some more. And the statute of limitations doesn't exist in the NFL circle. So I don't know, well, the episode has gone on long enough, but it's certainly a very big chapter that's closing. I'm starting my New York Law School class, my sports law class on Monday. I have to finish the syllabus tonight because my class starts next week. But I think I'm going to have like 3 classes specifically dedicated to Deshaun Watson, civil side, the criminal side, the NFL side. I don't know. It's a lot of interesting legal elements here. But Mike, I'm done. I emptied the full tank on Watson. I'm ready to not talk about Watson for like another week.
This puts a pin in our conversation about Watson. And for now, it puts a pin in the conversation about Watson's entirety of his civil suits here. I mean, we still have the one we're waiting on to see if that settles ultimately as well. And if more cases come out, then what do we do? Then what happens? Is there another arbitration that needs to be heard here? Is there more punishment that needs to be brought out?
I'll leave you with this, Mike. We're trying to figure out what we have not discussed. Our last episode, Mike, you and I were on it with John Nucci. We called it Sports Defamation. Trevor Bauer and Patrick Reed. Deshaun Watson has always claimed his innocence, right? That's the comment from the agent. Where's Deshaun Watson's defamation case, right? You're really that innocent, right? Trevor Bauer went out and he did it himself. I'm not Judge Robinson. I didn't hear the evidence, right? I wasn't the grand jury. But if you're going to boldly proclaim your innocence over and over and over, you're saying you did not do anything wrong. You're not apologizing, right? You are inherently saying that 25 women are lying, which there are people in my replies that are saying that, which is fine, right? How are they all represented by the same person? So, I'll ask you this, Mike, and this is not an easily answerable question if you're Deshaun Watson. Why have you at no point in this case talked about or actually followed through with the defamation case? Patrick Reed did it, right? Trevor Bauer did it. Casey Close did it. Where's Deshaun Watson's?
Because it truly comes down to it. He said, she said. I mean, they all are, but nobody knows what happened in those rooms. There were depositions that were conducted. But again, I mean, if there's any sort of veracity to their claims, why didn't Rusty Hardin file a motion to dismiss? If it didn't actually happen, then wouldn't that be their first avenue? Wouldn't they file a motion to dismiss?
The closest comparison in our sports, conversation right now is Trevor Bauer. Another he said, she said, no cameras in the room, no nothing like that. Bauer, say what you want about Bauer. The man has always said that he's innocent. He's always said the other side was lying. And I don't have anything to criticize Bauer for from a legal perspective. I'm not going to talk about anything with respect to the allegations. But Bauer put his money where his mouth is, and he said, they're lying. So if I can show that they're lying, I'm going to file a lawsuit. And he did it. So why there was no motion to dismiss? Because in the court of law, right, there's issues of gray. You have to show there's no factual issues in order to get a motion for summary judgment. You really can't win a he said, she said case. But if you're trying to protect your reputation, right, there's a difference between winning the case and just doing it, having a good faith basis for doing it, for protecting your reputation. And Watson hasn't taken that step. So I don't understand how this is just me not understanding the PR. Watson's proclaiming his innocence while not apologizing to the women. So, okay, Watson, you think the women are lying, and where's the defamation case? That's where my mind goes. And or he can speak about it, right? That he doesn't want to get hit with an anti-slap and have to deal with costs and whatnot. But I have not heard anything of the sort.
Yeah, but I feel like Bauer's a little bit, it's odd. The Bauer situation, we've talked about the comparisons to this, just mostly because of the allegations and how similar they are with sexual assault. Bauer went through the criminal process. They didn't find enough to bring charges, didn't find enough to grant a restraining order. It was the same thing with Watson. Watson went through grand jury and they didn't find enough evidence to bring charges as well. So now what we're seeing is Bauer going through the civil aspect of it. So Watson had all these civil complaints and we saw these depositions occurring, and we talked about in our last episode. Now Bauer is going to be moving forward with depositions and the he said, she said aspect of it. All he's basing his defamation case off of, right, the criminal aspect that we have a criminal judge, Superior Court saying that there was not enough veracity for the restraining order and the DVRO. So I don't know. I think what we're seeing with Watson kind of finishing in this settlement here could potentially happen with Bauer as well. And then we see Bauer do the same exact thing where he's claiming his innocence. He's claimed his innocence this whole time and then comes out with an apology. But I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, I don't have anything else to add. We have certainly emptied the tank and then some. I don't expect there to be any other worthwhile Watson news, but certainly when Dan Wallach is able to come back on, he again, we'll say it again, say it 100 times, Dan Wallach nailed the 11-game suspension. So Dan gets all the credit. There are other people claiming, oh, I predicted 11 games. No one else did. So call the shot at whoever is making that prediction. No one predicted 11 games. They predicted a lot of other things. Wallach nailed that 11-game prediction. So yeah, I'm certainly one to give Dan his flowers. Dan is always on the ball there. Okay, let us put us in the books. For Dan Wallach, myself, the entire Conduct Detrimental family, we'll see you next time on another episode of Conduct Detrimental.